Hello, and welcome to SecureTalk, a podcast where we explore the critical world of information security innovation and compliance. I'm your host, Justin Beals, founder and CEO of StrikeGraph. Together with our expert guests, we'll provide you tools and tips to help your business thrive in the rapidly evolving cybersecurity environment. Hello, everyone, and welcome to SecureTalk. This is your host, Justin Beals. Very recently, on October 11th of 2024, the U.S. Department of Defense released some information, a press release, about the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Program. As a matter of fact, on October 11th, the final rule for CMMC was published. What we understand about CMMC is the purpose of it is to verify that defense contractors are compliant with existing protections for federal contract information and controlled, unclassified information. And the Department of Defense broadly wants to make sure that all their vendors are meeting important cybersecurity practices. This is going to have a big change on these industries and companies that are vendors for the Department of Defense. We did an analysis ourselves of the available market or the cost of the change, and we project that over the next 3 years, more than $9 billion will be spent on companies meeting CMMC compliance. And of course, for our work here at StrikeGraph, it's a critical area of opportunity to continue building a great compliance platform and helping these organizations meet CMMC compliance. Of course, I'm not the deepest expert in this particular space, so today we've invited Stephen Ferrell, Chief Strategy Officer at StrikeGraph, to talk to us a little bit about CMMC and the impact it can have. Now, Stephen is an expert in software assurance, IT governance, and cybersecurity, particularly within the heavily regulated life and health science sectors. He serves as our Chief Strategy Officer at StrikeGraph, a provider of compliance posture management solutions. He is also the co-chair of GAMP Americas and sits on the International Society of Pharmaceutical Engineers GAMP Global Steering Committee. He contributed to the ISPE's GAMP IT Infrastructure Control and Compliance Guide and GAMP 5, the second edition. Prior to StrikeGraph, Stephen co-founded Compliance Path, which supports regulated clients globally, and the company was acquired by Ideagen in 2021. He advises the U.S. FDA on CSV, cloud, and data integrity matters. His compliance expertise encompasses regulations such as GDPR, the FDA, HIPAA High-Tech, and as well as standards including NIST and HITRUST. Stephen is a certified information systems auditor and holds a certification in risk and information systems control. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Ferrell back on SecureTalk today. Stephen, thanks for joining us on SecureTalk again. This will be twice this year.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Justin.
Excellent. Today we're talking about a little different topic than the last time when we spoke about life sciences and medical device, medical software. And we're talking about kind of a recent change in the compliance marketplace with CMMC. I think maybe you can give us a little background on why this is such a big topic of conversation lately.
Yeah, sure. So just in the last couple of weeks, the final CMMC rule came into place. And so this is essentially a cybersecurity hygiene standard for the whole defense industrial base. So anyone that serves the DoD or its satellite agencies is going to be impacted to some degree. And it was delayed, has gone through different iterations, and there's sort of a collective holding a breath to see if it would actually happen this time. But it has, so the clock is ticking for folks to get compliant.
This is going to do with almost any vendor, Homeland Security, Department of Defense, those types of organizations or subsidiary organizations, and being able to get or maintain a contract with them. Is that right?
Yeah, specifically, it covers CUI, so sort of um, confidential, unclassified information. So
Uh-huh.
anything that is not super sensitive but is being processed um, on behalf of the DoD. And if you think about the general sensitivity of everything that the DoD is doing, it covers essentially every interaction that you would have with them electronically.
Yeah. So, confidential, unclassified information. I mean, the confidential and the unclassified, I think, are telling words in this, right? And that the information is probably private. We don't want it to be leaked. We don't want it to be shared, but it wouldn't. There's a whole nother tier of compliance and security if you're dealing with classified information, which is a very distinct specification to certain intelligence, information, etc., that the government might be working with, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Is there anything that sets CMMC apart? Maybe we can start with what is it? What does the acronym even mean? I think sometimes we skip over that bit. Yeah.
Sure. It's the cybersecurity maturity model certification.
Okay.
So its basis is NIST 800-171. That's the standard that it is based on. And it gets certification applied to it because for the 3 levels, they each require a slightly different approach to certification. So there's an estimated 170,000 folks within the DIB space that will need level 1. There's about 80,000 folks that will need level 2. And then as you move up to level 3, the number gets smaller because they tend to be, the real heavy defense contractors. And so, a slightly smaller number, but not an insignificant. I mean, just between level 1 and level 2 is almost 250,000 contractors that are impacted by this.
Yeah. It's a pretty sizable change, especially for a lot of contractors that have these are all the existing relationships and not any new relationships the government might want to drive. Do they have some time period to get this in place? Is this, or is the door going to shut soon?
There is a bit of a rolling time frame. So it's 4 phases. Essentially, though, the 4 phases are more for the DoD than they are the impacted community. So they sort of reserve the right to start including it in solicitations right now. I think the hope is that it'll give people a bit of a break, but essentially, we're kind of in phase 1 now. Phase 2 will begin 12 months after the end of phase 1, and that's where you're going to start seeing level 2 certification actually be required in solicitations. And then a year after that, you're going to see phase 3 be required. And the expectation is 36 months from essentially the rule being finalized, it will be in every solicitation. There is a provision that they could waive it, but I think waive it in specific circumstances, but I think no one should count on that. And you'd have to have a very, very low risk use case and a very, very compelling thing that somebody needed to get a waiver. So I think people have to be realistic that they're going to have to get going on this now.
One thing I tell folks all the time is like these waivers and stuff are kind of a political liability when you ask for it from that individual, because they've got to go in and then sell you on a risk. And that's a hard road to climb as opposed to complying with the requirements.
Oh, 100%. I mean, it's already exceptionally difficult to get a government contract. And I think anytime you create an artificial blocker or, make it more difficult to do business with you than your competitor down the street, it's just not smart.
Yeah. One thing that we touched on, but we went through it pretty briefly, and I'd like to come back to it because it comes up in a lot of conversations with teams that I've had that are newer to compliance. They'll say, "Hey, we want to be NIST compliant," and I think sometimes they're not quite sure how NIST works and the relationship with something like CMMC or FedRAMP or other standards that are based on NIST. How can you help explain to us what that relationship is between the NIST cybersecurity controls, the 800 framework, and some of these standards that we go out and meet?
Yeah, so generally the NIST standards are just that. They're basically provided for different use cases, for the government to kind of pick up on. And then what happens around that is that then certification programs pop up and require parts of or all of those standards. Like FedRAMP, as an example, is based on NIST 853. Mm-hmm. CMMC is NIST 800-171. So the main difference being that there's some kind of certification or validation mechanism specific to, like a vertical, in this case, the DIB. But you could take another, part of the government could pop up and say, hey, we're going to have a security standard, and we're going to base it on NIST 171 as well, but completely, separate and siloed from any of the CMMC work.
Okay, great. I think, as an executive at a company, when I hear that description, even though I might want to pull like NIST 853 in the list of requirements that they had written, I'm almost more interested in the assessment methodology and what has been included in that assessment methodology, because that's more actionable. Like that's what I need. I need to meet FedRAMP. I need to meet CMMC. It's nice to know that the specification came from NIST at the end of the day, but really that is the blocker, the gate, the way I think about it.
100%. I mean, I think you really got to understand what it is, like what's your goal, building a cybersecurity program around NIST 800-171 might be a really fantastic thing for you to do as a good business practice, but without the CMMC certification or whatever you're trying to achieve certification wise, it wouldn't mean a whole lot other than making your day-to-day operations better. So I think you're right. I think it's really having a clear picture of, ultimately what certifications do we need and what's the best fit and the best path to achieve them.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit more deeply about who it's affecting, and maybe a little bit of how it's affecting. I know that we, of course, work with a lot of customers that are working on CMMC, and you've undertaken for us a couple of activities recently just to help us be aligned with their needs as well. What are some of the initial tactics that you've been taking for us?
So for us internally, the first thing that we did was a self-assessment. So anybody who is level 1 CMMC has to do this. Now, under the actual regulation and where we specifically set the type of tool that we are, we don't technically have to do it, but we felt like it was a smart thing to do to give our customers comfort. And also, I just think anytime you get to do a bit of a gap analysis and some kind of trust exercise, why not, right? Mm-hmm. So we did the self-assessment, kind of went through the process that any level 1 customers would have to do. From that, one of the things that's required is a system security plan. So we prepared that. And then we did an initial step, which was to sort of create a kind of a statement of compliance, if you like, which takes the SSP, takes our existing trust assets, and takes that self-assessment and sort of brings it together to kind of form, for our customers, a very quick understanding of where we sit in the sort of CMMC ecosystem. And so what we did ultimately is effectively what a level 1 customer would want to do.
Yeah.
And of course, our platform is set up in such a way that it easily facilitates that without, having to, recreate the wheel or do, a ton of manual labor or have spreadsheets everywhere.
Yeah. We always love, I think this is just an old product engineer methodology, but it's like, you can use your favorite metaphor, the minimum viable product, the crawl, walk, run, whatever you want. But I thought it was interesting that to kind of go through the stages, like we did a level 1. Let's say that we knew level 2 was in our future for some reason because we were doing a direct relationship with the DoD. Doing the level 1, I think, has really helped us now feel confident that were that to crop up, we have some analysis on the gap, what our controls are, and what we're meeting.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for anybody doing it, it's just a worthwhile exercise. Essentially, anyone that does it they start with 110 points, and then you sort of minus stuff off for any controls that you're missing. So it's a useful kind of numerical way of getting a very quick snapshot of where you are or you aren't relative to cyber hygiene.
Yeah, we don't get a lot of mathematically styled scores in compliance. It's either you missed the control or you hit the control expectation. So that's interesting. And the methodologies that we start with the assumption that we're doing great and go down from there.
Yeah, you start with 100%, and then you just kind of screw up as you progress through your certification.
Classic, yeah.
Yeah, and then there's like a 1, 3, and 5 kind of weighting depending on what it is that the assessment is calling for. So, once you get to the end, you sort of add it all up and then minus it off. But definitely an interesting exercise.
Yeah. So once a team might do a self-assessment, or if they're just big enough kicking off, the level 2, that requires an actual auditor, like a third-party assessor, to come in and do the assessment. Is that correct? Is that one of the major differences between the level 1 and 2?
That's the macro difference, but there is a nuance. There are some solicitations that will allow a self-assessment for level 2, but the OSA will still have to review it, and you have to enter your results into the supplier performance risk system, which you do that with level 1 as well, so that it's kind of on tap for any DoD contract that's looking to hire you or procure your product. I think that's going to be solicitation based. So, how and why there would be a nuanced difference there, I don't know. I suspect most people in level 2 will require a C3PO independent audit.
Yeah.
But they do have a provision in there for some use cases. So,
okay. So, like most of this stuff, it depends on the buyer and what they want.
It depends on the buyer, and I suspect, just seeing what we were seeing with previous federal stuff, the solicitations will err conservatively. Mm-hmm. So the chances of you not having to trying to be level 2 without a C3PO, I think, are slim to none, realistically.
Yeah. And then from a level 3 perspective, again, this might just be a macro understanding, but I think the auditor can't even be a C3PAO. The government themselves has to perform the assessment. Is that correct?
Yeah. So you still have the C3PO still has to do their thing to maintain you at level 2, but for you to maintain level 3, you have to then submit it to what's called the DIBCAC, which is the essentially the government's own certification center. So by the time they get to it, they've got a C3PO that said you're good for level 2. So I think what they're doing then is looking at the delta and being like, okay, from this point, we know that third party auditor is giving you the thumbs up. Anything in that mix to make us feel like you're not fulfilling your requirements. So they've got a little bit of insurance in there. As far as being able to handle that. But that's how it's designed at the moment.
Excellent. Okay. What do you think the level 2 self-assessment costs are going to look like? We get asked this all the time. How much will the audit cost? You have any, I realize that this is going to change and that as people get used to it, different pricing models are going to change for different companies. But, is there a sizes of the bread box rule of thumb that we should be thinking of?
It's difficult to assess, honestly. I think we've kind of heard things all over the map. I mean, I think you're safely in the safely over the 10,000 mark, I would expect. Mm-hmm. Probably in the multiple tens of thousands. It's 110 controls essentially, but which based on, we have other certifications we look at are in the multi-hundreds, but it's such a deep level of assessment that I just think by the nature of how long it will take, it will not be an inexpensive endeavor.
Yeah. I mean, I think the horror stories on some level has been ones like FedRAMP. We hear typically going in, over $100,000 per assessment easily. I've seen the more robust new PCI DSS version 4 audits going for over $50,000 for an audit. And I think, we could see similar things from the C3PAO community of auditors. Yeah, from a price perspective.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, tell me a little bit about, I realize that the DoD relationship is really affected by this, but you and I have been working with customers in very specific industries that this is impacting pretty heavily. What are some of the verticals that we're seeing an impact around this?
I think anybody kind of in the, broad manufacturing space, clearly anybody manufacturing munitions. Yeah. Musicians are safe from CMMC. They don't have to worry about it.
Yeah. That would ruin all the creative art.
It sure would. Yeah. No, they can continue playing guitar without fear.
Maybe the blues, it would fit well.
There you go. Well, I think anyone that has to deal with this is solidly playing the blues. So yeah, I mean, anybody making munitions or, aviation equipment or software, just broadly anybody manufacturing that DoD is buying. And I think some of the ones that we've come across that wouldn't be immediately obvious, or at least it wouldn't come to mind, right? I think you think DoD, you think, weapon systems, people selling medical equipment, right? Hospital beds, like, anything that's going into the that's been, procured by DoD. And again, it might be that those companies are level 1, but still there's no provision for the types of things that you're selling. The reality is, if you are party to information that, base ABCD suddenly needs X hundred hospital beds, well, why is that, right? Is there some military action that's about to happen that they need to, like you could piece together that kind of confidential and classified information and come to a conclusion, right? So as far apart as something like that is, I think there's a lot of folks out there that wouldn't immediately think they're impacted by this that potentially are.
Yeah.
Very, very broadly sweeping.
I have a family member that works on base as a civilian employee for the DoD, and they work in a capacity of social work for the staff on the base, especially the enlisted men and women. And I think about all the assets that she has to bring together through DoD contracting to perform something that doesn't seem like munitions or a concern, but it's about third-party risk, I think, for the DoD at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. What could you give us, since you did our self-assessment, I'm a little curious. I always have this truth that I try to express about a lot of these standards where people are like, oh, this is a security standard and therefore everything's about encryption and data backups. And like, actually a whole lot of these standards are about HR and business processes and financial fraud prevention. How did you feel about the layout of the standard itself? Like, what were its focus areas?
Yeah, it's a very good question. You must do this a lot. Oh. I actually thought it's quite well done. Actually, I think it's across the I forget how many exact questions there are, but across the 110 points, it's quite practical. Nothing particularly strange, nothing, out there. I think everything they asked for. I think it really is a hygiene standard, right? It's not a deep dive, understand every packet in your network type of thing. It's very much about, I don't want to say the basics because that kind of undersells it, but it's definitely like a first level. Have you done this cybersecurity standard, as opposed to like a really deep domain specific. There really isn't anything in the CMMC that I saw that jumped out of me, and I thought, oh wow, that's super unique to DoD. Like I think you could take that framework and you could apply it to all kinds of verticals. There's no defense flavor to it that I found anyway as I went through that process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny because I have this, I remember ISO 27001 used to have a part of the standard that was about where your network clock was located and how that was utilized. And a lot of people that I would talk to would be like, I don't know what it's asking for. I'm like, oh, you've never racked hardware or had to run a clock in a server system before. You've had the network provided for you in such a way. But also, most companies don't anymore. And so I think in the latest versions of 27001, that particular part of the requirement is no longer included because it's just not a big part of the requirement issues. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to make sure I'm catching some of these concepts really well. One is that we'll see CMMC as a part of the requirements. I think you called it a solicitation or like the RFP from the DoD starting already, right? Like going forward.
At the moment, they have the right to include it.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a little bit of a grace period where they may choose not to, but I don't know why they wouldn't. I think it's very likely that you'll start seeing it sooner rather than later.
And then they'll specify what level of assessment they need for that particular solicitation. So there's a level 1, which is generally a self-assessment. A level 2 will mostly be a C3PAO assessment, but we might get some self-assessment in the solicitation. And then a level 3 being a C3PAO plus a government auditor in the mix.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then it did sound like you mentioned that there is a platform the government is providing for organizations that have been through any level of CMMC assessment to submit the outcome of that assessment so they can store it.
Yeah, the supplier performance risk system.
That's hard to get a acronym for. It's too many consonants.
Yeah, SPRS.
Thanks. Good. Awesome.
Solid stuff.
Yeah. And I think, well, you've been through the self-assessment with us already, and it seems like you felt like it was a pretty actually positive request and nothing bizarre in the assessment, and actually pretty measured approach to being able to look at a gap and how we're performing and what the expectations might be.
Measured approach, and I think by the nature of what we do as a business, it wasn't particularly difficult for us to answer. I think if you are, making widgets, and you're not thinking about cybersecurity all day, it might be a little bit more challenging. But again, not because the questions are unreasonable, but because for a lot of folks, they just will never have come across something like this before, I suspect.
Yeah, I think there were two things I want to highlight that we did that made it easy. Of course, we operate this on our platform, but it's not an absolute requirement to have a platform like ours to do this. But one is, I think we had our SOC 2 audit with all our controls listed and what we've gathered and tested already. So I believe that helped in doing the self-assessment quite a bit.
It did, yeah, because you have two things. You have the benefit of being able to understand what our control is, and then you also have the benefit of it having been third-party reviewed, right? So it's not just me saying, "Oh, I think that's in policy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5." So we're able to tie it back to our SOC 2, which is then tied back to an actual auditor's attestation. So it kind of gives another level of, assurance. And I think for anybody that already has certification standards, I definitely would encourage that kind of crosswalk activity that we did, because, one control can serve many masters, as opposed to trying to have a completely verticalized CMMC approach. Because I don't think it's practical, and two, I think you're almost playing pretend. You can't have two policies that do the same thing for two different things and expect anyone to follow both. So, I think that crosswalk thing is really critical.
Yeah, this is, of course, I think core to the way we think about our platform and some of the value we provide is that it just gets exponentially complicated with every standard. And once you get an extra standard and another standard on top of that, it's 3x as complicated as the initial standard that you started with. And there is a lot more opportunity for failure, either in audit or in effective practices, day to day. Yeah. Well, that's excellent. Stephen, of course, I really appreciate you working on this with us and our customers. And also, I know our listeners at SecureTalk really appreciate having some pragmatic visibility into what's coming and how to prepare for it effectively. So thanks for being our expert and sharing that with us today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's always good to catch up.
Excellent. All right. Have a great weekend. Thanks, Stephen.
You too. Thanks.